Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. This will be the final lecture for Chapter 3. In your textbook, please turn to page 59. Some of these coding conventions we went over as part of the guidelines at the beginning of the chapter, so we won't spend a lot of time on them. We talked about NEC and NOS. If you'll turn to page 60, your textbook talks about brackets and parentheses, and we actually talked about those in the last lecture and went over those in detail. Turn to page 62. And exercise 3.5 instructs you to use the alphabetical index to identify the main terms and identify whether the bolded term is an essential or a non-essential modifier. So anything bolded we know is not the main term. So if I go to the index and I put in cataract, and now I need to see if immature is an essential or non-essential modifier. And in this instance, immature is in parenthesis next to the main term cataract. It is a non-essential modifier. So whether our documentation says cataract, cortical cataract, immature cataract, incipient cataract, those terms in parenthesis do not affect the selection of the code for cataract. And the default code for cataract is H26.9, and we know that because this code is right after this main term. Now, if I want to look up nuclear cataract, you'll see that nuclear is not in parenthesis. So if I put in cataract and then a comma and begin typing nuclear, you can see that nuclear is an essential modifier. If it's embryonal, I'm going to choose the code Q12.0. If it's sclerosis, then I am going to go to cataract senile nuclear. And that code is H25.1. So basically, with these essential and non-essential modifiers, if it's a term in parenthesis following the main term, it's non-essential. If it is a term that in fact has its own code that is different from the default code, then it is an essential modifier. So blue cataract, the term blue is an essential modifier because when it's combined with cataract, it yields the specific code of Q12.0. Congenital cataract, Q12.0. All of these terms that have a code following them are considered to be essential modifiers. So now let's look at hypertension. Now when I go to hypertension, look at all these non-essential modifiers. Accelerated, benign, essential, idiopathic, malignant. These are all terms that when they are combined with hypertension, they do not change the code. So if I'm looking for essential hypertension, I find essential in parenthesis following the main term, and the default code is I10. So essential is a non-essential modifier for hypertension. And then we have filarial infestation. Now when I look at infestation, there are no non-essential modifiers here. And so if and you have to spell right. If I put in filarial, I have the code B74.9. That is an essential modifier because that term does have a specific code. The default code for infestation is B88.9, and that particular code is infestation unspecified in a category for other infestations. When I go down and look at filarial B74.9, it's in a different category. It's in a category for filariasis, and it is filariasis unspecified. So they are different codes. And then we have thyrotoxic exophthalmos. Oh, what did I put in wrong? XOPH. Okay, so thyrotoxic exophthalmos. Do we have any terms in parentheses? No, we do not. And when I add the thyrotoxic, it tells me to see hyperthyroidism with goiter diffuse. When I go, the code is E05.00. So thyrotoxic is an essential modifier. The next punctuation that we see used in the tabular is the colon. And the colons are used after a term that require modifiers to follow that code so that it's assignable, meaning that the terms before the colon are incomplete without one of the terms following the colon. And basically they don't want to have to list all those. They don't want to have code first, underlying physiological conditions such as Alzheimer's. Code first, underlying physiological conditions such as cerebral lipidosis. Code first, and yada, yada, yada. So instead of saying code first every single time, they just say the code first and do a colon and then list all of the conditions that have to be coded first. And you'll see this quite often in your textbook. You also have, if you look at figure 318, that code is I-52. And this tells you code first, congenital syphilis, mucopolysarcoidosis, schistosomiasis. I have no idea what that is or actually how to pronounce it. Not a term I have really ever encountered. Schistostos. So anyway, you don't need to listen to me try to figure that out. The point is that when you have the colon, the instructional note before the colon applies to each of the terms individually following that colon. We've talked about inclusion notes and inclusion terms, which are not the same as excludes notes, and we have gone over excludes 1 and excludes 2 notes, and those are on page 63 and 64. If you will look at this first example on page 64, this patient comes to the hospital with severe constipation, and the patient's diagnosed with congenital megacolon. And so the code for congenital megacolon is K59.3. Now, or the code for megacolon is K59.3. When we go to that term in the index, we can see clearly that congenital megacolon is excluded. So it has a different code. And if I go to megacolon, we can see that the default code is K59.3, but there is a specific subterm for congenital, Q43.1, and that corresponds to what we see in the tabular. So if we went to megacolon and we did not see the congenital for whatever reason, once you get to the code K59.3 and you read all of the instructional notes, which you should do every time you code, you would see that congenital megacolon codes to Q43.1. And of course that category is for congenital malformations of the intestine. It's in a completely different chapter than K59.3. It's in the chapter for congenital malformations, whereas K59.3 is in the chapter for diseases of the digestive system. In the next example, the patient comes in with stomach pain. They're diagnosed with diverticulitis of the colon and the appendix. This would require two codes, one for the colon and one for the appendix. So let's look this up. And if I look up diverticulosis, no, it's diverticulitis. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do, it should go down to, why isn't this working for me? Oh dear. Usually when this happens, it's because we're having issues with 3M. So let me, okay. Unfortunately, well, I'm going to see if I can rectify this issue. I'm going to pause this recording and then see if I can come back into 3M. If not, unfortunately, I'll have to record another lecture and pick up at this point. Okay, fortunately I was able just to close it out and come back into it, and sometimes you may also encounter that type of a situation. Basically, I just closed the integrated codebook and then went into the, that took me back to the main 3M page, and I just clicked on my I-10 book again and it popped up and it seemed to search appropriately for me. So the colon is not an option, so we know that the colon is part of the intestine, and it's the large intestine. And so when we see this code, K57.32, we click on that code, and we want to scroll up to the beginning of this category. And when we get to the beginning of this category, we can see that we have an excludes note 2, diverticulum of the appendix, K38.2. And so that is our big clue that we have to have two codes for this, one for diverticulum of the colon and then the code for the diverticulum of the appendix. And actually, if I come back to the index, diverticulum of the appendix, if we go to, in this example, example. It says that the patient has diverticulitis of the colon and the appendix. There is not a code for diverticulitis of the appendix. However, when we looked at the code for K57, K57.32, and we looked at the instructional notes, that was our clue. K38.2 was the code we needed for diverticulum of the appendix. And actually, if we go to diverticulum, we'll see appendix, and we'll see that code K38.2. So it's very important to read those instructional notes. And this isn't the only example of when there's an instructional note to code something else and it gives you the code for it, but it's difficult to find it in the alphabetical index. So always make sure that you look at those particular notes. Now let's look at exercise 3.6, and it says using the tabular answer the following questions. Well, we're going to look at these odd numbered questions. So the first one is bronchitis due to fumes and vapors, assigned code J40. So if we look at this category, we see that in our excludes note 1, we have an excludes note that says, bronchitis due to chemicals, gas, fumes, and vapors is J68.0. So the answer is no. It's not. It's assigned to J68.0. Let's look at number 3, category J03. And this question says, is gangrenous tonsillitis assigned to J03? And if we look at acute tonsillitis, we can see that we have in our excludes note 1, we don't have an excludes note here for gangrenous tonsillitis. And as we scroll down and look, we can see that J03.9 has a term, gangrenous tonsillitis, and this is an inclusion term, and so clearly gangrenous tonsillitis would be assigned to J03.90. Well, it would be, we don't know whether or not this is recurrent. We're going to assume that it's not, and so that would actually be our code. But yes, J03.9 is the correct J03.9 is the correct category for gangrenous tonsillitis. And then for number 5, we're looking at K65, peritonitis, and the question is aseptic peritonitis included? And clearly we can see we have an excludes note 1, and aseptic peritonitis is not included. It is coded to T81.6. And if we scroll up, you'll notice these codes are all red. So if we scroll up, we can see that these codes require a 7th character to designate whether or not that it's an initial encounter, a subsequent encounter, or a sequela. And come on. And in T81.61 is the aseptic peritonitis. On page 65, your textbook talks about etiology manifestation conventions. And we talked about and looked at etiology manifestations in an earlier lecture. And With some disease conditions, they may have an underlying etiology or a cause, and then they also have a manifestation, and that manifestation is the direct cause of that underlying etiology. In ICD-10, that underlying condition is sequenced first, followed by the manifestation. So there are two codes that you use, and we looked at this one earlier. For instance, dementia with Lewy bodies. And if we look at this code, G31.83, that's the code for dementia with Lewy bodies. And you notice at the beginning of this category, it tells us to use an additional code to identify dementia with and without behavioral disturbances. So if we have Lewy bodies, dementia with Lewy bodies without a behavioral disturbance, we're using G31.83 and F02.80. If it's with a behavioral disturbance, it's F02.81. If we look at Parkinsonism, if we look at this code G31.83, again, it's the same code. Parkinson's disease, you'll see that the first listed code is Parkinson's disease, G20, and the dementia without behavioral disturbance is F02.80 with behavioral disturbance F02.81. If the patient had Parkinson's disease with violent behavior, F03.91. If the patient had dementia and they were an alcoholic, in this instance, it's not an etiology manifestation. So let me move on from there. Epilepsy. So we have dementia in epilepsy. We have the code G40, and this is the category for epilepsy, and then we have the code for dementia without behavioral disturbance and with behavioral disturbance. So that is consistently what you'll see with etiology manifestations. You have to use both codes and you have to sequence them the way they're listed. When you're actually writing the code, you do not use the brackets and you do not underline the term. You just list the first code with a comma and a space, and then the second code. No brackets. Look on page 66. In this example, the patient has idiopathic gout of the right foot and has a calculus of the urinary tract. So we're going to look up the code for gout. So they have gout of the foot. And you'll see that this sends us to the tabular to category M10.07, and then we have to choose the most specific code, so it's M10.01. And then once we go up to the beginning of this category, you can see that we have an instructional note. Use additional code to identify calculus of urinary tract in diseases classified elsewhere. That code is N22. And so this tells us, and then you notice when we get here, we have a code first underlying disease, and gout is specifically listed. But this is, if I come over here and I put in calculus urinary, and track is a non-essential modifier. It takes you to N20.9, which is the category for calculus of the kidney and urinary bladder. There's not an instructional note here that tells you, oh, if this is in a disease classified elsewhere, choose N22. And you can see when I look at calculus, if I go down, let's see if I can find in disease classified elsewhere. No, I don't see it there. Urinary, that's where we were before. In due to, not there. So if I had not looked at the instructional notes, then I'm not sure that I could have come back to calculus, the term calculus, in the index and found that code N22.0. That is one of the challenges of ICD-10. We've only been using it a year, in that there are some areas that definitely could use a little beefing up and a little improvement. So you can see, I mean, scrolling down through here, N22.0, I just don't see it listed. So just beware of that. Another reason you have to read those instructional notes. Now, we have, in the next example, the patient has an ulcer of the right ankle due to diabetes type 2. Let's see if... Okay, if I put in ulcer and diabetes, it says C diabetes, ulcer. So I put in diabetes, and it says by type. Now this patient has type 2. So what I'm going to do here is do diabetes 2 with skin ulcer. So diabetes type 2 with skin ulcer, NEC, E11.622. When I go to that code in the tabular, it tells me to use an additional code to identify the site of the ulcer. I want to scroll up and look at instructional notes, and it says use additional code if there's insulin use. If a type 2 diabetic requires insulin, there is a Z code that you use that indicates that. So there's really not another instructional note here. And then the code for the ulcer of the right ankle is L97.319. So we want to find the ulcer of the ankle. If we look for ankle, we can see ankle's not there. The ankle is part of the lower limb, and we're actually going to put ankle, and then this is right, the right ankle. The default code is L97.319. We don't have documentation of any necrosis, bony necrosis, or an exposed fat layer or muscle necrosis. It doesn't say that it's skin breakdown only. The most accurate code for us is L97.319. In the next example, the patient has a UTI due to E. coli. And in this example, if we go to infection, urinary tract, the code is M39.0. And it tells you to use an additional code to identify the agent. And see, it gives you a range of codes right there. And if I go to Escherichia coli in the index, it says, as cause of disease classified elsewhere, B96.20. And so we must list and sequence these codes in the order that you see in your book, M39.0 and then B96.20. Now, I can go to infection and Escherichia coli, and you can see this code A49.8. That would not be appropriate in this instance because the Escherichia coli is causing a urinary tract infection. And so you can see also listed as a more specific subterm as cause of disease classified elsewhere, B96.20. Now, your question for this lecture, I have two questions, or two sets of questions. First, I want you to tell me when you have an etiology manifestation and you are writing the codes, do you use the brackets? Yes or no? And then also, I want you to, for exercise 3.7, I want you to answer questions 1, 3, and 5. And that is going to conclude this final lecture for Chapter 3. If you have any questions, please let me know.